Hey everyone, I'm Ian, and today we are going to talk about the arcade classic, Pac-Man.
Yep, it's really good.
Okay, that's it for today. I'm LyingTuna signing out. Bye-bye. Okay, fine, let's look at something else too.
The Pac-Man franchise is a personal favorite of mine. Having revolutionized the world of video games upon its release in 1980, the original arcade Pac-Man is still probably the most iconic video game of all time, or at the very least of its era. It's gotten countless sequels and spin-offs, some of which I've looked at in the past, but what always stuck out to me as particularly interesting were the various times that they decided to take Pac-Man as a character out of the confines of top-down maze gameplay, and instead stick him in some other genre, like Pac-Man 2 on Super Nintendo. I have no idea what this is supposed to be.
But with the Pac-Man franchise turning 40 this year, I thought it was a good time to shine the spotlight away from Sonic for a little bit and look at some of the games in the franchise that I personally grew up with.
Now, I played a lot of Pac-Man as a kid. I was obsessed with the classic maze games, and I played them basically all the time, but the games that stuck with me the most, predictably enough, were the Pac-Man World games, a series of 3D platformers starring Pac-Man. The series actually has a mildly interesting history in platformers prior to these games, with the arcade game Pac-Land in particular being an incredibly important and influential title when it was released. Now it's just that one Smash stage nobody likes, but you know, whatever. Now, I didn't actually have Pac-Man World 1 when I was little. I started with Pac-Man World 2, but I played the hell out of that game. I loved it. I then got World 3 when it came out, and yep, that also exists.
I actually didn't play Pac-Man World 1 until I was in middle school when I first got a PS1, but, you know, given that it was a 20th anniversary title, it does seem like a perfect fit for this video. So with all that out of the way, let's get started with Pac-Man World for the PlayStation.
This game actually had a surprisingly difficult development period. It went through a few different iterations before the final product, most notably Pac-Man Ghost Zone, which, yep, I'm basically good with this being cancelled, ew. The game starts off with a story cutscene, which is about as deep as you'd expect for a Pac-Man game. The ghosts kidnap all of Pac-Man's friends and family before his birthday party on behalf of Talkman, a giant evil robot of Pac-Man who I just really like, and I'm not sure why. He's just kinda goofy. Pac-Man sees this, gets annoyed, and goes off to Ghost Island to save them. It's a basic story to be sure, but the handful of FMV cutscenes we get are very well animated and very pleasant, so I like it. I also really like the first stage, actually. Buccaneer Beach is a great intro level. It starts you off with a little maze full of dots and ghosts, and the camera pans up to a bird's eye angle, much like the original Pac-Man arcade games, but then, after you eat all the dots and the ghosts, you'll see there are fruit sitting up on all the boxes that make up the maze, causing you to jump up to collect them. This subtle, small transition from the Pac-Man of old to this new, at the time at least, 3D Pac-Man platformer gameplay is a really neat touch that helps keep things feel like Pac-Man despite the complete shift in both gameplay and aesthetics. This level also just does a really good job of teaching the player all the mechanics of the game and generally demonstrating what the game as a whole is going to be, which is, of course, a 3D platformer. Ish.
Okay, so like, you know how Crash Bandicoot is basically a 2D platformer flipped to 3D? Well, Pac-Man World is like if you took Crash Bandicoot and just flipped it back to 2D again.
You do have full 3D control of Pac-Man, and the levels are three-dimensional, yes, but the camera is always locked and almost always at this very classic 2D-looking angle. Again, think Crash Bandicoot level design, but with the camera from the side. It's kind of weird at a glance, but it won't take long to get used to. It's just very odd moving mostly left to right in a 3D platformer instead of holding forward the whole time. In terms of actually navigating Pac-Man through these stages, I'd say it's mostly decent, though definitely not perfect. Pac-Man's control is locked to 8 directions even when using the analog stick, which does make sense given the hardware it was released on. I don't actually have any issues with this since the level design is fairly blocky, and for the most part, I think his movement is pretty satisfying. He has a satisfying and pleasant running speed and weight about him, and his jump feels really good too, conserving all the momentum off of any kind of moving platform. What's less good is the collision detection. It definitely feels pretty off for most of the game, which is most noticeable during these intense platforming sections. Pac-Man does have a ledge grab that he can use to pull himself up, but it barely functions most of the time for seemingly no reason, so you'll find yourself clipping through the edges of platforms all the time. This is mitigated to an extent by the butt bounce though, yeah. In addition to running and jumping, Pac-Man of course has a few different moves that he can utilize. The butt bounce is easily the most notable one. By hitting the jump button again in midair, you will cause Pac-Man to bounce off the ground. This gains him a little extra height and distance, which helps make those jumps a lot easier. It also completely ignores inclines, which seems very much unintentional, but it allows for some pretty fun platforming, even if not always in the way the developers necessarily intended. In addition to also acting as your primary means of attacking enemies. The other move you'll be using for stage navigation is the Rev Roll, which it's the spin dash. This is just, that's the spin dash.
I thought we were taking a break from Sonic, but fuck me, I guess.
It's useful for getting around a little quicker and jumping off of ramps, but I just don't find myself using this thing all that much. The main purpose it serves is supposed to be speeding up steep inclines, but you can just butt bounce, so who cares? The most use you'll get out of the rev is actually for these platforms you can stand on and rev to move them. They fucking suck. I'll get to these later. Finally, you have the ability to throw dots that yet ate. Okay, this is purely for attacking enemies, and it's mostly useless since you throw them straight down at your feet. There are enemies with some seriously busted hitboxes that it's really helpful against, but otherwise, you'll mostly be sticking to the butt bounce, which, as unstable as it can feel at times, is a lot of fun to navigate stages and fight enemies with. Speaking of fighting enemies, even though the majority are taken out by these various attack moves, the classic ghosts can't be. They can only be beaten by eating them after collecting a power pellet, just like in the arcade original, and that's an awesome feature. One of the most satisfying feelings in gaming history is eating a ghost in the original Pac-Man. The way the action all just stops dead, and that incredible sound effect makes it an awesome feeling, and that is replicated beautifully in this game. Sure, they might break up the flow a little bit since you have to find a power-up to defeat them, but the satisfaction that it entails is worth the effort to me. Plus, unlike other enemies, you'll actually regain some health if you eat all the ghosts in a given area using a single power pellet, which means that in a pinch, some skillful play can really save your ass. Power pellets aren't the only power-ups you'll find either. There's also the super butt bounce thing that it only shows up like twice, so it's not very useful, but hey, it looks cool, right? The power-up you'll be using the most in this game is the metal ball that turns Pac-Man into metal. In this state, he's invulnerable and also sinks underwater.
This is just Mario 64. It's the exact same thing. Yeah, it's not exactly a criticism at all, but Pac-Man World really doesn't bring a whole lot new to the table. Again, not anything I hold against the game, just something I thought was worth noting.
Well, power-ups aside, there are other collectibles available too. There are letters hidden throughout each stage that spell out Pac-Man, and if you get them all, then upon completing the current level, you'll be taken to a bonus stage where you can earn fruit. Yeah, the fruit are here too, of course. They serve two main purposes. The first is operating the slot machine at the end of each stage. This thing is super handy since every time you match 3, you'll get an extra life. Pro tip, banana is always followed by orange, so if you keep that in mind, you can get it every single time and farm dozens of lives in no time, which is pretty handy by the time the game ends. Their other function is more hands-on, serving as a means of unlocking doors hidden throughout each stage. These doors are usually where you'll find the Pac-Man letters, though sometimes you'll find other fruit or switches that you need to use to progress. If you find the Galaxian item and take it back to the door that it opens, you'll be transported to a classic Pac-Man maze. I love this, in theory. The execution isn't perfect, though. The gameplay here is identical to that of the original Pac-Man, eating dots and avoiding ghosts, which I think is an awesome inclusion, but the issue is that the mazes are full of obstacles that run on timers. Since Pac-Man can't stop moving, you'll be taking damage in these constantly, which sucks, because they actually use your health and lives from the main stages, despite basically being a mini-game. Also, the maze layouts are kind of weird. They're square and asymmetrical, which is just odd. The default camera is also so close that it's basically unplayable, but you can pull it out with the right trigger, which does help a lot, but I usually skip these, unfortunately. The final collectible in this game is the key, which is the only one that's actually required. Remember how Pac-Man's family got kidnapped? Well, the key allows you to open up the cages that they're locked away in. Sometimes the key and the cage for a particular world are in separate stages. That's the case for the first world, but for the most part, you'll find them pretty close to each other. It's typically just a matter of finding the cage and then doing some backtracking to get the key.
And yeah, you'll be doing a lot of backtracking in Pac-Man World. It's probably what I would consider to be the game's biggest weakness. Every level is full of it.
That isn't to say that the level design is bad, mind you. On the contrary, I actually think it's mostly rock solid. Levels are almost all pretty short, but they're super dense with platforming sections and enemies. They all end up taking forever to beat, though, because of the constant backtracking. I mentioned the fruit doors earlier, and those are the main culprits. They usually just contain the Pac-Man letters, so they are optional, but since you also need to find that key to progress, you'll be stuck checking every single one. Usually the fruit is located around a minute or so after the door in the stage, meaning you'll be running back and forth constantly. I found this especially annoying in the Ruins world. This is the second set of stages in the game, and it's easily the worst. These booby traps are everywhere, and they have super broken hitboxes, so getting past them once is a pain. But you'll be going back and forth all the time in these levels. It gets really tedious, and that's an issue that does persist throughout the rest of the game, although definitely to a lesser extent. Aside from that, though, I actually really enjoy most of this game's level design. As I said, the stage design is very dense with a lot of platforming and enemies, and when things do get a little more plain and hallway-ish, there are usually ghosts and dots to keep you stimulated and to keep that Pac-Man vibe going strong. Stages are often broken up into fairly discrete sections that are separated using one of the 3 transitional level gimmicks. One is the bedoing, it's a trampoline that you butt bounce on, as well as these elevators using the rev rolls. These suck, man. They take so long, they're so slow. If these weren't everywhere, honestly, the rev would probably be a much more entertaining move to use, but unfortunately this is just what my mind associates them with, so that's not necessarily ideal. Sometimes you'll also encounter these chains of Pac dots that Pac-Man will fly along, which is a very pleasant sight, to be honest. I like this. Despite all of these gimmicks serving the same basic function, having 3 distinct level transitions is really nice since it keeps things from getting stale and helps the levels feel fresh, even when the structure never really varies. There are boss fights at the end of every world that help keep things fresh as well, and these are all over the place. Some of the fights are total jokes, like the first boss and the boss of the factory world, and this bumper car race in the circus level is a cakewalk. Then there's the Ruins boss, Anubis Rex, which is like actually impossible, at least impossible without dying. It starts with this really cool Crash Bandicoot style chase sequence before transitioning into this phase where you have to rev on these platforms to open them up to get a hit. It's not so bad at first, but each of the 4 phases of this fight adds a new attack. By the end, it's a straight up bullet hell, except with Pac-Man's busted hitbox making it a total nightmare. Fortunately, I knew this in advance and stocked up on lives from the slot machine, and you can just kinda brute force the last 2 phases and get away with maybe 3 or 4 lives lost. The boss of the space world is actually harder in my opinion, since brute forcing him isn't really an option. It resets each time you die, so all 4 phases have to be done in 1 life. With that said, I actually love this boss. He's called King Galaxian, and as the name implies, he acts as a tribute to Galaga and Galaxian. The whole thing plays as one of those games, and the music is this awesome Galaga remix. It's so cool. It would be the best boss in the game if not for the final boss fight with Pac-Man. This fight is excellent. He uses variants of all the moves you have at your disposal, and you need to match whatever moves he's using to damage him. The only phase that's a little frustrating is the final one, where he uses the rev roll, since getting hit launches you to your death, making it a one-hit kill. Once you figure out how to dodge that though, you're left with what I honestly think is a fantastic final boss. Definitely a great note to go out on.
And yeah, that current positive vibe I'm giving is something I really want to emphasize. I've been kind of harsh on the game, sure, but Pac-Man World is definitely worth your time. It does a lot well, both in terms of gameplay and presentation.
The game looks really nice. I don't think it's one of the best looking games on the console or anything, but it's bright and vibrant, and with a lot of charm and flair. Pac-Man in particular looks really good. He's a sprite with separate models for his arms and legs, which is apparent at times, but it's worth it to keep him looking this round and bouncy. The different worlds are all realized very well, and my favorite on a visual level is the final one. It's all Halloween themed, which makes sense since it's supposed to be the main headquarters of the ghosts. The rest look really good too, although the Ruins level is a bit dark for my taste. I could say more or less the same for the music. It's really good stuff. Not one of the best soundtracks of all time or anything, but every song fits every stage well, and they include remixes of various jingles from the arcade games in every track, which is a really nice touch for an anniversary game like this. A few of the tracks that stand out in particular are Far Out from the Space World and Under Pressure from the Factory. These are excellent tracks, if a little on the short side, but yeah, that's basically it for Pac-Man World. It's a solid game, if not a perfect one. There's a lot of stuff that could have been done better, and it generally is in the game's sequel, but that doesn't mean I don't recommend playing the original as well. There's a lot of fun to be had here, and I think it's well worth your time despite my various issues with it.
At least that's how I feel about the PlayStation version. The game also had some ports, so let's give those a look real quick.
First, there was a PC port exclusive to South Korea. I can't find any gameplay or information about it other than the box art, but I wanted to mention it because, look at this, it's fucking hilarious. The other port is much more accessible, and it is for the Game Boy Advance. It's basically a straight conversion of the PS1 game to a GBA cartridge, and it's really impressive, actually. It kind of looks like Sonic Blast, which is gross, but the level design is almost a pitch-perfect recreation of the PS1's, which is pretty cool. Actually playing this isn't exactly the best though. The completely static 2D perspective makes the platforming really tough. Depth perception is already kind of an issue on the PS1 version at times, but here it's a straight up nightmare to try and judge jumps. As a standalone product, I wouldn't really recommend playing this, but if you play and enjoy the PS1 version, then it's definitely worth a look, at least for novelty's sake, if nothing else.
But yeah, that's Pac-Man World. Definitely a really cool game that I think you should give a try. We're going to be looking at its various follow-ups in some upcoming videos, but first we got to get back to Sonic. The new movie's coming out in just a couple weeks, and I gotta ride that hype train while it lasts, right? But you know, with that all out of the way, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more from me. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below letting me know what you think of the video and of Pac-Man World and its sequels, because I just like hearing what you guys have to say. Join the channel Discord server, link to that's in the description, and with that all being said, I hope you guys have an awesome day. I'm LyingTuna, signing out. Bye.